In 1878, Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, were embroiled in a fierce competition. Each city wanted to be the biggest and best in the state. Would you believe this competition involved a tug-of-war, with the President of the United States caught in between? In 1878, that president was Rutherford B. Hayes, who served from 1877 to 1881. Hayes was from the state of Ohio. President Hayes appointed William G. Leduc as his Commissioner of Agriculture. Leduc had served as a quartermaster during the Civil War, rising to the rank of brevet brigadier general. Like President Hayes, Leduc was originally from Ohio, but had moved to Hastings, Minnesota. In the summer of 1878, Leduc and the Minnesota Agricultural Society invited President Hayes to the Minnesota State Fair in St. Paul. President Hayes accepted the offer, stating that he had always had a strong desire to see St. Paul. Therefore, plans were made for the president to travel from Washington, D.C. to St. Paul, Minnesota. He would travel with his wife Lucy, 3 sons, and several members of his cabinet. Hayes would become the first president to visit the state of Minnesota. When St. Paul and Minneapolis were initially settled, they were located about 9 miles apart. As the cities grew, they eventually became one large metropolitan area. When looking at their populations, since St. Paul was settled first, it had a larger population than Minneapolis for quite a few years. However, in 1878, Minneapolis had just barely become the larger city. In 1878, each city held its own fair on exactly the same dates, September 2nd through 7th. With the support of the State Agricultural Society, St. Paul called itself the State Fair, and President Hayes was its main attraction. Minneapolis called its fair the Exposition, and Senator James G. Blaine was its main attraction. Senator Blaine was from the state of Maine, and happened to be one of the Republican challengers to President Hayes in the 1876 presidential election. The initial plan was for President Hayes to travel by railroad to Hudson, Wisconsin, on September 4th. The following morning, President Hayes would reach St. Paul and spend most of the day there. The president would then leave St. Paul that evening and travel northwest, where he would reach Fargo, Dakota Territory on the morning of September 6th. After a stop in Fargo, he would travel a little further to the west and tour a bonanza farm. After this brief stop, the president would continue westward to Bismarck. On the morning of the 7th, the president would travel back to the east to Brainerd, Minnesota. Since the president did not believe in traveling on Sundays, he would spend the day in Brainerd. Finally, on Monday morning the 9th, he would travel back to St. Paul, then make his final stop at Hastings, Minnesota. In actuality, some of these plans stayed the same and some changed. On September 4th, President Hayes rode the train to Hudson, Wisconsin. As was the custom of the day, a reception committee from St. Paul met the president in Hudson to accompany him to Minnesota. The reception committee included the current governor, John S. Pillsbury, and the current mayor of St. Paul, William Dawson. It also included ex-governor Henry H. Sibley, General John Gibbon, and ex-governor Alexander Ramsey. The presidential train arrived in St. Paul around 5 in the morning on September 5th. Several thousand people had gathered in the streets and around the depot, most of them staying up all night just to get a good place to view the president. Being quite early in the morning, the crowd remained silent, just observing the arrival of America's chief executive. The city of St. Paul was excited to show off for the president. From the depot in St. Paul, President Hayes was taken to ex-governor Alexander Ramsey's house, several blocks away, for breakfast. Ramsey had a beautiful home on Exchange Street in St. Paul. After breakfast, a parade was planned from Ramsey's house back to the railroad depot. The parade route followed Exchange Street to 3rd Street, or along the business section of town. Here the buildings were decorated with flags, banners, and streamers. People filled every window and jammed the streets. At the depot, the party boarded a train which headed northeast, then northwest, then west, and finally south to reach the state fairgrounds. The local newspapers had advertised the presidential visit as the prime fair attraction. Minneapolis newspapers joked that the president shared his top billing with a horse, which was named Rarus. At the fairgrounds, President Hayes boarded a carriage and was taken to the presidential pavilion, where he made a speech to the crowd. The speech was probably a little boring, as the president discussed the financial condition of the country. After his speech, the crowd asked to hear from Old Probabilities, which was a nickname for General Albert J. Meyer, the head of the United States Signal Service. The Signal Service was the predecessor to the modern-day National Weather Service. Meyer answered the call and told the crowd he was along on the trip to learn how his department could help farmers. The presidential party was then treated to a fruit table and lemonade, a welcome treat on the hot and dusty day. People continued to pour into the fairgrounds, where they witnessed a sharpshooting display, horse races, exhibits of farm products, and an elk team pulling a carriage. Native Americans of the Chippewa tribe set up teepees on the grounds and showed off their agricultural products. As for President Hayes, he was like one of the exhibits, and was constantly surrounded by crowds of people. The local newspaper estimated that he must have shaken 20,000 hands and worn out a dozen pencils signing autographs. When his time was finished at the fair, he was taken back to St. Paul to attend a reception in his honor at the Metropolitan Hotel. There he continued to make the rounds and shake hands. Late in the evening, the presidential party made their way back to the depot, boarded their train, and departed to the northwest for Fargo, Dakota Territory. The presidential party had swelled to include the governors, senators, and leading citizens of Minnesota. As they awoke early on the morning of September 6th, they were near Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. A crowd had gathered at its depot to see the president. After a few more miles westward, the train arrived in Fargo. This is a bird's-eye view of Fargo, drawn in 1880. The presidential train tracked westward to the Headquarters Hotel. The Headquarters Hotel was built right along the railroad tracks in the middle of Fargo. Here the party stopped and had breakfast. Several hours later, the presidential party reboarded the train and continued further west to the Dalrymple Bonanza Farm. There, the party boarded wagons and a buggy for a tour, which was led by Oliver Dalrymple. The Dalrymple Bonanza Farm was located about 18 miles west of Fargo along the Northern Pacific Railroad track. The land was flat with no trees, but had excellent soil for growing wheat. The Dalrymple farm had 13,000 acres of wheat, and the harvest was yielding about 25 bushels of wheat per acre. The presidential party got to see 40 steam threshers at work, 50 teams plowing, and 36 railroad cars being filled with wheat per day. These bonanza farms were farming operations on a huge scale. Dozens of men and horse teams would harvest huge fields of wheat at one time. These harvesting groups would move up and down the fields. The horse team pulled the machine that cut, arranged, and bound the wheat. This process left bundles of wheat up and down the fields. These bundles were brought to the steam threshers to extract the wheat seeds. Once the fields were harvested, they could be plowed under again. The presidential party posed for a photograph at the Dalrymple farm before they left. This photograph is courtesy of the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center. The presidential party traveled back to Fargo, where they had a midday meal at the Headquarters Hotel. This seems like a simple thing, but it was a major diversion from their original itinerary, as they were supposed to travel from the Dalrymple farm to Bismarck. What changed the plan? Minneapolis still wanted President Hayes to visit their town and their fair, so President Hayes had to make a choice: Bismarck or Minneapolis. He chose Minneapolis. The Bismarck Weekly Tribune was left to state that although parades, salutes, and a ball was planned, the president didn't come. The presidential party also took a different route back to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. This time they traveled southeast and then east, over the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. They made it back to St. Paul late that evening, where President Hayes again stayed at ex-Governor Ramsey's house. Meanwhile, the Minneapolis newspapers proudly announced that President Hayes would visit their city and their fair the following day. On the morning of Saturday, September 7th, President Hayes traveled from St. Paul to Minneapolis, where he had breakfast with Minneapolis Mayor Alonzo Rand. Minneapolis was located on the west side of the Mississippi River and had become a flour milling giant. From the city of Minneapolis, the presidential party proceeded to the Minneapolis Fairgrounds. Interestingly enough, in 1878, the Minneapolis Fairgrounds were not that far from the St. Paul Fairgrounds. When it came down to it, the Minneapolis and St. Paul fairs were very similar, even in their layouts. The Minneapolis Fair had an entrance, a mechanical hall, which housed the latest steam engines and ironworks, an agricultural hall, where farm produce and products were housed, a machinery hall to display the latest agricultural implements and buggies, a lumberman's building, which showcased the latest milling products, stables for the livestock, an art hall for paintings and other artistry, office buildings for the local newspapers, a racetrack of various distances, a grandstand capable of seating 6,000 people, a judge's stand, dining halls to feed the people, and a bandstand for the band. Minneapolis was proud of its fair buildings. This is a layout of Mechanics Hall. The various display areas were listed by number. In the center, a fancy fountain was constructed. President Hayes was driven around the Minneapolis Fairgrounds in a fancy Studebaker carriage. Studebaker heavily advertised their products in the Minneapolis newspapers that day. Like he did at the St. Paul Fair, President Hayes gave his speech about the financial condition of the country. However, the president also commented that he was glad to see that Minneapolis could rapidly turn the raw materials that he had seen in Minnesota and North Dakota into finished goods. The crowd again called for old probabilities, the head of the United States Signal Service. Once again, General Albert Meyer came to the podium and gave a few quick comments. First of all, he said he was glad that the forecast for good weather at the fair that day had come true. Then he admitted he had been very impressed by the huge fields of wheat he had seen. After the speeches, the crowd broke up and spread out to view the exhibits. The presidential party was taken back to Minneapolis, which also held a parade in his honor. President Hayes was shown the large flour mills along the Mississippi River, including the Washburn A Mill, the Washburn B Mill, and the Humboldt Mill. To end the day, an evening reception was held in his honor at the Nicollet Hotel in Minneapolis. After this gathering, the president boarded his special train and returned to St. Paul and the Ramsey House. President and Mrs. Hayes spent a quiet Sunday at the Ramsey House, but did venture out to attend church. On Monday, September 9th, the presidential party left St. Paul for Hastings, Minnesota, which was the home of his agricultural commissioner, William Leduc. One of the first planned stops in Hastings was Vermilion Falls, on the southern edge of town. Here the railroad crossed the Vermilion River in a beautiful park-like setting. Despite the beauty, the First Lady noted that the falls were a very dangerous place for children. The presidential party was then driven to William Leduc's residence for a banquet, which was followed by a trip to the Hastings Courthouse for a reception and more speeches. At this point, the party reboarded the train and departed for Red Wing, Minnesota. At Red Wing, the president was welcomed by another big crowd. He was taken to the St. James Hotel, where another reception and more speeches were given. Finally, the presidential party reboarded the train and continued southeast, passing through Winona and out of the state of Minnesota around midnight. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.